How we doing, everyone? This is Dr. B. I'm coming to you from Yokuts and Mono territory here in the Central Valley of California. If you didn't know, Native American Heritage Month is celebrated throughout the month of November. This is a chance for us to celebrate the contributions, the histories, and the cultures of Indigenous peoples across the Americas. So in celebration of Native American Heritage Month, I wanted to dispel some myths and stereotypes about Indigenous people and also share with you some interesting facts about Indigenous life here in the United States and across the Americas. Okay, so let's start with terminology. I always tell people, call individuals what they want to be called. There are terms like Indian, American Indian, Native American, and there are some confusion. I've had students often ask me, well, what term should I use? The term that is being used mostly today is Indigenous or Indigenous peoples. There's also the tribal names as well. So when referring to a particular tribe, you should always use the tribal name. And one of the biggest problems with terms like Native American or American Indian is that they tend to homogenize Indigenous people. Indigenous peoples are incredibly diverse. Our cultures are not all the same. We don't all have the same religious and spiritual practices. Our social institutions also differ quite a bit. So when in doubt, ask. And if somebody corrects you, don't be offended. Remember, Native Americans are very different, and there's a lot of different tribal names. So how many different Native American tribes exist here in the United States? Well, there's over 550 tribes that have federal acknowledgement. But what exactly is federal acknowledgement? Well, this means that our federal government, the United States of America, acknowledges that these communities exist not simply as communities, but they exist as distinct and sovereign nations. Prior to 1492, there were literally hundreds of distinctive Native American nations that existed across the Western Hemisphere. And today, the United States government acknowledges, again, over 550 Native American nations exist within the borders of the United States. These nations act as sovereign and distinctive governments. They elect their leaders, they have their own social institutions, and so on. I think it's also important to note, however, that there's several Native American communities that have existed since time immemorial, but unfortunately the federal government does not acknowledge them as distinctive nations. So not all Native American communities are acknowledged by the federal government. Here where I live in the San Joaquin Valley, there's several Native American communities that, again, have been around since before the United States was even created, but the United States government does not acknowledge them as a nation. So how long have Native Americans existed in the Western Hemisphere? This is what I always tell people, is that Native Americans have been here since time immemorial. So since the beginning of time, Indigenous people have existed throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. So what was life like here in the Americas before Europeans arrived? Well, the stereotype is that all Native Americans lived in teepees and hunted bison. The reality is that only a handful of Native Americans actually did live in teepees. Native Americans in some cases were nomadic, and they did hunt and they did subsist off of foraging. But wherever you go throughout the Americas, Native American lifestyles and life ways would differ dramatically. In some cases, Native Americans lived in major civilizations. There were some communities in South America where you literally had tens of thousands of people living in a concentrated area. And then there's some areas like in California where tribes are mostly hunter-gatherers. Some tribes are farmers. So Native Americans, wherever you go, the lifestyle, the culture, the language, the ways that people did things differ from place to place. And that's what really does make Native American culture and Native American life ways so interesting and so dynamic. So everything that Native Americans do here, all of our inventions, all of our life ways are unique to us. And so you see a major diversity of communities who have a number of different ways of doing things, and that's what makes, I think, Native American culture so amazing and so absolutely beautiful. Indigenous people spoke literally hundreds of different languages. Their religious and spiritual traditions were incredibly diverse as well. You shouldn't look at Native Americans as being one homogeneous group. One of the most important things I think everybody should acknowledge is that Native Americans are diverse. Native Americans are not all the same. So the way people lived, their style of dress, the foods that they ate, the homes that they lived in were incredibly different from region to region. So let's talk a little bit about language diversity in Native Americans. Native Americans literally spoke thousands of different languages across the Western Hemisphere. Here in California alone, there were more languages spoken by indigenous communities than all of Europe. Still today, Native Americans speak their languages, but unfortunately, because of settler colonialism and the history of the boarding school system and all these assimilation policies that were set up by the federal government that were really meant to eradicate Native American culture. And part of that assimilation program that was set up was to destroy Native American linguistic diversity. So sadly, some of these languages aren't being spoken today. And many of the speakers who do still speak their languages are elders. But there is a language revitalization movement taking place across the United States. Native American communities recognize how important the linguistic tradition is to their culture. And so Native Americans are working on creating dictionaries and language revitalization programs to make sure that their languages exist into the future. One of my favorite topics to talk about in regards to indigenous peoples is all the amazing foods that Native Americans create. Native Americans invent corn, squash, beans, potatoes, chili peppers, varieties of tomatoes, avocados, different species of cotton are invented by Native Americans. Tobacco is a Native American invention. I mean, think about this for one moment. Imagine the culinary arts without foods like chocolate. Yes, Native Americans are the ones who invent chocolate. Native Americans are drinking hot chocolate before anybody else. Over 50% of the foods that we eat today come from Native Americans. In fact, 3/5 of all cultivated crops that we grow here in 2022 are Native American inventions. Foods like maple syrup, cornbread, even turkeys are domesticated by Native Americans. Cranberry sauce is a Native American food. Native Americans also had some of the most dynamic political structures. One of the oldest living democratic structures is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This confederacy is made up of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. There's also a sixth nation that was incorporated into the Haudenosaunee Confederacy called the Tuscaroras. This confederacy was a group of Native American tribes that at one time were at war with each other. And over time, these tribes came together. They developed a political philosophy that was centered around peace. I'm going to argue that our government, the way that we are structured on a federal level, was influenced immensely by Native Americans. But Europeans, when they come here, they don't know anything about freedom. They don't know anything about what it means to be able to be free, to have your own government that really truly does represent the people. This is something that Europeans learn from Native Americans, including the Haudenosaunee people, but there were several Native American communities that had confederacies, that had these really unique political structures that were all centered around the idea of freedom. Again, this idea of freedom as an American value really is traced back to indigenous peoples of the Americas. Because of settler colonialism, obviously, Native American political structures are quite a bit different today than they were in the past. But the Haudenosaunee people today, here in 2022, continue to practice their form of indigenous democracy. And I would argue that Native Americans bring to the table some really important ideas when it comes to individual liberty and freedom. There's a lot that we have learned from Native Americans in the past. Some of this history, unfortunately, has been buried, but Native American political philosophy has had a major influence on our way of life. There's so many different contributions on the part of indigenous people that go way beyond political philosophy. We're talking about contributions in mathematics, engineering. Native Americans were incredible military strategists. You had great warriors like Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Geronimo, Osceola, Tecumseh. Native Americans had forms of public education, again, bridge building, canal building, apartment style living, city planning. I could go on and on and on about the contributions of Native Americans. One of the stereotypes about Native Americans is that Native Americans all rode horseback. Well, the reality is this, is that Native Americans didn't have horses here in the Americas until Europeans bring them here. But when Europeans bring horses to the Americas, Native Americans quickly adopt them into their culture. And some of the most famous Native American tribes are your tribes of the Great Plains. These people were amazing equestrians. Not only did they learn to ride horses, but they also learned to breed specific type of horses for their needs. So some of the horse breeds that Native Americans created were your Pinto and your Appaloosa. These horse breeds were highly sought after by Europeans. In fact, some of the military generals often wrote about how the Native American horses were superior to their own horses. So Native American contributions are vast. Athletics, sports like lacrosse is a Native American game. We can go on and on about Native American contributions to the world. And many of these contributions, unfortunately, are completely unknown to most people. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the spiritual and religious traditions of Native Americans. Now, remember what I said, Native Americans are incredibly diverse and different. So wherever you go, the spiritual and ceremonial practices of Native Americans are going to differ. But these ceremonies definitely have some commonalities. One commonality is this idea that everything is related and everything is interconnected. There's also a commonality among all Native Americans that the land is sacred. I would even argue that Native American spiritual and religious traditions are land-based. If you destroy the land, you destroy a culture. You destroy the spiritual practices of the indigenous group that lives there on the land. This is one of the reasons why Native Americans are so adamant about protecting their homelands, because there's all these different shrines and sacred places that Native Americans have gone to practice their ceremonies, to honor the cycles of nature, to honor the planting seasons and the harvesting of crops, the rites of passages, and so on. And again, like I said, Native American religious traditions are very diverse. They're different wherever you go. Some Native Americans are going to do things a little different, but it's all centered around this idea that human beings need to be good caretakers of the land, that we're all interrelated, that we're all connected, and that the land is a major part of our culture, a major part of our worldview. So you destroy the land, you're basically destroying a culture, you're destroying the language, you're destroying what makes Native Americans, what makes all indigenous peoples unique. And that's why Native people are so insistent on protecting their homelands. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new in this short video on Native American cultures, contributions, and inventions. Obviously, feel free to share the video, and if you like the content, please subscribe to the channel. The indigenous cultures of the Americas continued to adapt and thrive here in 2022. It is Native American Heritage Month, so let's do our part and support tribal sovereignty and help amplify indigenous voices. This is Dr. B. Until next time, peace. Land back. Let's go.